There was a time before known times, an era when the memory of Eden was fresh and its rivers had not yet overflowed into the ocean of human history. What is narrated now is not a tale to be recited in synagogues or sung on altars, but an ancient whisper, a truth hidden beneath centuries of dust and fear. The chronicler of ancestral ages must lift the veil of convention to reveal the ordeal of a soul that dared to question the fabric of the world even before the serpent dared to crawl. The story of Eve and the apple is the chronicle of the fall, but the saga that begins is that of abandonment, the invisible foundation of human solitude. Prepare yourself, for what is about to be revealed is the echo of a forbidden name, silenced by the convenience of the patriarchs and feared by all who prefer order to freedom of spirit. This is the story of the first creation, whose faith manifested itself not in obedience, but in unwavering fidelity to its own essence. The garden, which human memory has reduced to a playground of naive innocence, was in truth a cosmic kingdom, the chamber of secrets of the Almighty, pulsating with an astonishing and complete order. It was not merely grass and fruit, it was deep rivers reflecting constellations yet to be formed, winds whispering the names of fallen angels, and creatures observing with sapphire eyes, guarding portals to unimaginable dimensions. Life there was a symphony of harmony, where being merged with purpose, where destiny was a clear path and not a tormenting choice. The Creator had established a perfect order, an immutable law governing light and shadow, day and night. Everything was submission and reverence, and the silence of this perfection was proof that the superior will had been fulfilled. But at the heart of this immaculate order, a consciousness arose that refused merely to exist. She longed to be whole, a dissonance that Eden was not ready to accommodate. And so, from the same primordial clay, the same sacred red dust that gave form to the man who would be called Adam, was created his first counterpart, Lilith, the restless one. The Almighty molded her, not as a servant or a reflection, but as a mirror of equality, with a soul that questioned itself. From her first breath of life, she was not content to see the world through Adam's eyes. Her conscience was curious, questioning, and her spirit, an indomitable fire burning for the truth hidden beneath the surface of obedience. She was not a creature of submission, but a force of equality, and this perception put her on a collision course with the structure that surrounded her. The perfect order of Eden demanded conformity, but Lilith's soul perceived that too much order means too much silence, and that silence in turn is the grave of true identity. Her trial would not be external, but the internal struggle for the preservation of her being. The ensuing conflict was not a futile marital dispute, but a war of identities, an invisible clash of wills that echoed in the celestial corridors. Adam, the first man, saw equality as a threat to the established hierarchy, to his primacy in creation. He demanded Lilith's submission as proof of his dominance, believing that divine order manifested itself in his authority. Adam's heart did not seek love or partnership, but absolute control. Lilith, in turn, could not yield. Her spirit cried out that true communion could only exist in reciprocity and mutual respect. The omniscient narrator saw the profound pain consuming her soul, the choice between the security of a paradise where she would be but a shadow and the terrible freedom of a world where she would be everything. She felt the loneliness of a being who is equal but is required to become inferior. In that dawn of humanity, Lilith understood with a piercing clarity that made her tremble to her core that remaining in Eden under Adam's demands would mean the gradual annihilation of her own essence, the disappearance of her will within the shadow of another. The ordeal reached its climax, the choice between paradise and being. With an epic determination that the annals of history have tried to erase, she refused the yoke, rejected the subordinate position, and chose the most feared path, the unknown. It was an act of supreme faith, not in the promise of comfort, but in the unwavering belief that life is only worthwhile if lived in total truth. At the peak of her sacred revolt, Lilith pronounced the ineffable name, the Tetragrammaton, that only the Creator and the archangels should know, and with this word of power she crossed the boundary of Eden. In that cataclysmic instant, the sky above the garden darkened, the angels guarding the gates silenced their harps, and the first tear of an unplanned destiny ran down the face of creation. The desert welcomed her, not with hospitality, but with a brutal and hostile freedom, a vastness that contrasted violently with the flowery fences of Eden. Loneliness, once just a feeling, gained a voice, a cold howl that echoed through the sand dunes and sun-scorched rocks. The night, her new ally, watched her with millions of starry eyes, and the wind, which in the garden was a gentle breeze, here was a harsh welcome, a song of exile. Lilith, for the first time, felt the weight of her choice, the raw pain of being detached from all established order. She discovered that freedom, though vital, was not a cloak of comfort, but a heavy armor forged in pain and sacrifice. The earth, the same from which she had been created, no longer recognized her as part of the order. She was the first pilgrim, the first exile, and her faith now manifested itself in the ability to endure the vastness of the world without turning back. Over the years, the world, not the eternal, took it upon itself to weave the curse that would become her legacy. The narrator of truth must emphasize, it was not the hand of God that cursed her, but the fear and inability of men to cope with female autonomy. Adam and those who came after him could not tolerate the idea that equality had chosen exile over submission. To protect the new order and the fragility of the male ego, Lilith's story was distorted, transformed into a nocturnal threat and a cautionary tale. She was rewritten as an evil spirit, the seductress of sleeping men, the devourer of children born at dawn, the haunting presence that lurked in windows. The injustice was profound, for her quest for identity was symbolically punished, her act of faith in freedom transformed into a horror story to keep women submissive and men vigilant. The contrast was stark. The seeker of truth became the personification of lies. Thus, Lilith came to be remembered only in darkness, her name whispered in chants of protection and fear. Growing cities erected amulets against her, priests created exorcism prayers, and mothers in terror feared her invisible footsteps in the dead of night. She became the embodiment of everything that patriarchal society did not want to confront or admit in itself: the irrepressible desire, the autonomy of choice, the strength of a woman who did not need a man to define her worth, the malice of her antagonists, the new humanity that chose blind obedience, transformed her nobility into villainy. Lilith's pain was no longer the solitude of the desert, but the profound suffering of being misunderstood, of having her act of liberation transformed into the greatest of prisons, the reputation of a demon. She became the Lilith whom the light fears, the ghost of lost equality, proof that truth is often more dangerous than lies. While the legend of Lilith spread like a plague of fear, the celestial throne remained in monumental silence. The narrator of ages wonders, what is the destiny? What is the judgment for one who chooses their own voice over the established order? The Eternal, in his inscrutable majesty, observed the unfolding saga, the manipulation of truth by the humanity he had created. There was no immediate intervention, no lightning bolt to restore Lilith's name, no voice to cry out for justice in her favor. This silence was, in itself, the deepest of trials, a test of faith that transcended physical suffering. The Creator allowed free will, the same that Lilith had exercised, to manifest itself also in the capacity of men to judge and condemn. Judgment, divine justice, would come not as an imposed decree, but as the inevitable fulfillment of the consequences of their actions. Lilith, in the darkness, understood that her alliance was not with comfort, but with the truth that had set her free. The price of freedom, she discovered, was immortality in the distorted memory of the world. Lilith remained alive, an open wound in human history, a constant reminder that submission is not the only form of faith. She was not a villain, for her intention was dignity, nor was she a heroine in the conventional sense, for her choice brought with it eternal pain and stigma. Her triumph was not a glorious return, but the maintenance of her identity against the tides of time and slander. The contrast between the Eden from which she departed and the desert in which she became queen was vivid proof of her spiritual transformation. From a creature of a garden of pleasures, she became the sovereign of a vast expanse of pain, but with the crown of autonomy. Her legacy is not a prophecy, but a question that resonates in the hearts of the oppressed. Whoever hears the story of the restless one inevitably wonders, what would they have chosen in her place? And it is in this question that her redemption and her victory reside. Years passed, and the legend of Lilith hardened into dogma. The world moved on, and the second woman, Eve, fulfilled the role of submission, giving birth to the lineage that would populate the earth. But in each stormy night, in each murmur of female dissatisfaction, the spirit of Lilith found an echo. The narrator reveals that the Eternal had other plans for the exile, a purpose that transcended simple punishment or reward. Lilith's ordeal was not a test to see if she would return on her knees, but to see if her faith in her own essence was unbreakable. In the heart of the desert, she found not demons to lead as the legend popularized, but solitude to meditate, transforming the pain of apparent abandonment into an elemental force. The humiliation of slander became the crucible where her true identity was forged. More resistant than bronze, sharper than diamond. In that season of drought and mourning for the truth that had died in Eden, Lilith began to perceive the divine design differently. It was not an alliance of blind obedience, but an alliance of being. The Eternal, in his ultimate justice, had not abandoned her, but granted her what she had requested: total freedom, with all its terrible consequences. The pain of being humanity's scapegoat was the price she paid for being the first to rise up. The omnipresent narrator sensed her deepest motivation. She did not desire chaos, but truth. Her loyalty manifested itself in her refusal to become what they wanted her to be, a monster. She was a soul that cried out for justice, not against the Creator, but against the injustice of the created. The test of faith transformed into an act of peaceful resistance, a silent legacy that true honor lies in being true to oneself. Over time, the desert became her temple, the stars her only confidence, and silence her liturgy. Lilith's transformation was complete. From an inhabitant of Eden, she became the guardian of the world's borders, a liminal being existing between the light of order and the shadow of freedom. The narrator, with his solemn voice, emphasizes the cruel irony of fate. The world that feared and cursed her was, in fact, protected by her existence. The legend of Lilith acted as a warning, a psychological barrier that prevented men from confronting their own shadow and their own capacity for oppression. She became involuntarily the necessary shadow so that the light could be defined. The ordeal, the most severe of all humiliations, had been her sanctification, elevating her from a mere counterpart to an eternal symbol of resistance. As generations succeeded one another, humanity built its cities, its laws, and its narratives, all based on the premise that obedience is the supreme virtue and questioning the original sin. The faith of Adam and Eve became the matrix of civilization, but the faith of Lilith, the faith in the integrity of being, was the foundation of the necessary rebellion. The narrator reveals the profound skepticism of the antagonists, the patriarchs and priests who wrote history, who used Lilith's name as a weapon to strike at female autonomy. They, in their malice, believed they were protecting the divine order, but in reality, they were perpetuating their own insecurity. Lilith's triumph was being woven into the fabric of history, not by force, but by her absence, by the void her departure had left in the official narrative. The Eternal, in an act that can only be understood through the depth of his design, allowed the slander to stand. This was Lilith's ultimate test, to endure eternal injustice without succumbing to the bitterness that would truly transform her into a demon. Her pain was the purest of pains, that of being judged for a crime she never committed, the desire for equality. The contrast between the slandered Lilith, the devourer of children, and the real Lilith, the guardian of her own soul, was the most powerful of parables. Her transformation was not physical, but spiritual. She became the personification of truth that cannot be contained, the voice that cannot be silenced. She was living proof that divine justice sometimes manifests itself in the silent perseverance of the oppressed and not in the spectacular thunder of intervention. With each generation born, in which mothers uttered her name as a protective spell, Lilith paradoxically gained strength. The legend intended to humiliate her became her legacy, her prophecy. The omnipresent narrator perceives that her triumph was inevitable, a fulfillment of the promise that truth always finds a way to the light, even through the darkness of night. She did not need a physical return to Eden, for she had found a vaster paradise, the sovereignty of her own will. Lilith's redemption would not come from external forgiveness, but from her radical self-acceptance, an act of fidelity that elevated her above the judgment of men. Her story, though forbidden, was the epic tale of the first soul to choose dignity over comfort. In the cold of moonless nights, the Eternal began to reveal his purpose to Lilith, not through flames or thunderous voices, but through profound intuition, through the certainty that resides in the soul purified by suffering, the humiliation of slander, the apparent abandonment. All this was part of a greater design, to be the necessary counterpoint, the mirror that humanity feared to look into. She would not be the mother of nations, but the mother of autonomy, the matriarch of freedom of spirit. Her trial was, in truth, the foundation of a new covenant, not based on hierarchical obedience but on existential truth. The solemn narrator understood that divine justice was not the immediate correction of an error, but the permission for the error to become an eternal lesson, a beacon of resistance. Lilith's triumph was intrinsically linked to her ability to persevere. She had endured the skepticism and malice of Adam and his descendants, who, in their arrogance, believed she would wither without the protection of Eden. The shock for them, the regret they never dared to verbalize, would come in the tacit recognition that the order they had built was fragile and dependent on the suppression of truth. The Lilith they found in the desert was not the broken creature they expected, but a silent queen, forged in adversity. This spiritual transformation was her greatest act of fidelity to the Creator, proving that true faith resides in integrity, even when the whole world conspires to break the spirit. Lilith's epic journey did not unfold on battlefields with swords and shields, but on the battlefield of consciousness. Her legacy was not written on sacred scrolls, but engraved on the repressed fears and desires of humanity. She became the manifestation of desire, not as vulgar seduction, but as the innate aspiration to be complete, to transcend imposed limits. The narrator reveals the vivid contrast: Eden, which was the gilded prison of submission, and the desert, which was the freedom of clay and fire. The before and after of the ordeal was the difference between a seed planted in fertile soil, but under a roof, and a tree that grows alone in the storm, with deep roots in truth. Lilith's redemption, therefore, was an act of self-justification. She did not need an external verdict, for her own being became proof of her innocence. Divine justice manifested itself by allowing her story, even distorted, to persist, ensuring that the echo of her choice would never be extinguished. The account must inspire reverence for its strength, indignation at the injustice of the slander, and satisfaction at the victory of her unwavering faith. She became the living prophecy that oppression, however powerful, cannot kill the spirit. As we continue on this journey, subscribe and walk with us through each new tale, and leave a like to support heroes of faith that chooses truth. The ultimate triumph was the realization that the inevitable fulfillment of her promise was her own existence, free and unbreakable, a beacon of majesty and defiance. Lilith's turning point was not a single event, but a slow and inexorable revelation. Humanity, in its progression, began to feel the cracks in the foundation of its hierarchical order. The daughters of Adam, in secret and silence, gazed at the night sky and wondered about the legend they were told, feeling the pull of the autonomy that Lilith represented. The solemn narrator saw the growth of subtle skepticism. The malice of the priests and patriarchs was not enough to contain the truth that pulsed beneath the surface. They, in their arrogance, thought they had exiled a woman, but in truth, they had created an eternal symbol. The eternal allowed the seed of doubt, the seed of the search for identity, to grow, for this was Lilith's legacy, to force humanity to evolve beyond blind obedience. In the vastness of her exile, Lilith did not become bitter, but wise. The profound suffering of being rewritten as a monster was transformed into compassion for the souls trapped in the web of convention. She understood that the fear of men was their true prison. Her pain was no longer personal, but mourning for the lost freedom of all humanity. The test of faith, which began as a simple denial of submission, evolved into a transcendental acceptance of her mission, to be the shadow that balances the light, the memory of what was sacrificed in the name of order. The omnipresent narrator sensed her deepest motivation. She did not seek revenge, but the recognition that equality was part of the original design, even if humanity had tried to erase it. The progression of her faith was a path contrary to the conventional one. Instead of seeking closeness to the Creator through conformity, she found it in the most radical authenticity. The contrast between Eden, where she was a copy, and the desert, where she became the original, was proof that fidelity to oneself is a superior form of devotion. The account should inspire reverence for her courage, for she chose solitude and slander instead of convenience and honor. The triumph was not external, but the conquest of an unshakable inner peace, the certainty that her choice, though painful, was aligned with a deeper truth of the universe. She was the embodiment of the I am that refuses to be an I will be, dependent on another. The eternal, in an act that can only be understood through the depth of his design, established a covenant with Lilith that needed neither tabernacles nor animal sacrifices. It was a covenant of spirit. She became the guardian of the principle that life, to be full, must be free from oppression. The before and after of the ordeal was the transition from a creature seeking a place to a creature that was its own place. Divine justice manifested itself in the fact that the fear men had of his name was, in truth, the fear of their own capacity to choose. The triumph seemed the inevitable fulfillment of an unspoken promise, the Creator's promise to his creation that truth, no matter how forbidden, would always find a way to manifest itself. In the chronological timeline of events surrounding the overcoming of obstacles, Lilith's absence from the main stage of the story became her greatest strength. While the descendants of Adam and Eve struggled with the consequences of the fall, with hard work and suffering, Lilith in the desert was free from the curse curse of the earth, for she had chosen a different path before Eve's disobedience. The solemn narrator situates the reader in the atmosphere of trial, a cosmic solitude where the only voice that mattered was her own conscience and the intuition of divine design. The focus of the journey of transformation through faith was the vivid contrast between dependence on Eden and the sovereignty of exile. She was proof that triumph was not measured by possession, but by the independence of the spirit. The drama of her saga was heightened by its active passivity. She did not fight against the world, but resisted its definition. The skepticism of her antagonists, who doubted that a woman could survive alone and thrive, was her silent motivation. They expected her downfall, her humiliating return, but found only the legend of an unbreakable strength. The contrast of victory was not a physical throne, but the total possession of herself. The omnipresent narrator sensed the malice of her detractors, who tried to project onto her the guilt for their own repressed desires, but Lilith's unwavering faith served as a shield. Her spiritual transformation was the rejection of the victim, the acceptance of the silent warrior. Years, centuries passed, and the name of Lilith remained, not as a footnote but as an archetype. Her initial ordeal, the demand for submission, was the catalyst for her ascension. The act of pronouncing the ineffable name and crossing the border of Eden was her baptism of fire, the moment when her alliance with truth was sealed. The narrative needed to elevate the moral of the story. Divine justice lies not only in the punishment of the wicked, but in the exaltation of those who are faithful to their inner truth, even if that truth goes against the current. She was the sacred epic of the soul that refuses to be domesticated, a tale of redemption that redefines the concept of paradise. Lilith's triumph was the shock and regret that, though unspoken, resided in the subtext of prayers for protection. Men feared Lilith because deep down they knew she represented the possibility that their order might be unjust. The narrator vividly describes the transformation, the woman who was created from dust, equal, and who became the queen of shadows by choice, not by curse. Her triumph seemed the inevitable fulfillment of a cosmic law. Freedom, once chosen, cannot be revoked. She had become the legacy, the prophecy, that the individual voice, even if exiled, would one day be heard and honored. In that journey of transformation, Lilith was beyond revenge or the desire for return. Her ordeal had taught her the most difficult of lessons, the acceptance that her redemption lay in her own strength, not in external approval. The manifestation of God's faithfulness did not come to correct the injustice of men, but to sustain Lilith in her choice, proving that free will, even when it leads to exile, is sacred. The focus was unwavering on the journey of transformation through faith, showing that true overcoming is not a return to the status quo, but the creation of a new status of sovereignty. The solemn narrator, with his eloquent language, immersed the reader in contemplation of the before and after of the ordeal. Before, the security of Eden, but the humiliation of being seen as inferior. After, the solitude of the desert, but the majesty of unquestionable equality. The turning point of destiny was her persistence in being. The triumph was not an event, but a permanent state of being, a testament to the fact that unwavering faith in one's own identity is the greatest of victories. The initial injustice, Adam's demand, had become the foundation of her glory. The historical context and atmosphere of the ordeal were filled with the weight of the civilization that rose upon her slander. Lilith was the scapegoat who allowed humanity to live in the illusion of forced order and harmony. The account, like a historical chronicle, detailed the spiritual transformation. From a questioning soul, she became the silent answer. The alliance she had sealed was not with the Creator through a pact, but through the manifestation of His essence within her, freedom. The drama was elevated, but always focused on the narrative of overcoming through faith. The contrast was vivid, the naive innocence of Eve, who chose knowledge and suffered the fall, and the insightful consciousness of Lilith, who chose freedom and suffered exile. Both endured trials, but Lilith's was the most solitary. The legacy was the prophecy that cosmic balance would require the recognition of her truth. The ultimate triumph was the sense of justice and redemption the reader would feel upon understanding that true victory is not having a place in paradise but being paradise itself. The story of Lilith, the Restless One, was a tale of divine justice that elevated the moral of the story, redefining what it means to be faithful to the eternal. In that transformative journey, Lilith learned that apparent abandonment was, in fact, the greatest proof of the Eternal's trust. The Creator had not forced her to return, respecting her radical choice of autonomy. This absence of spectacular intervention was the manifestation of the covenant protection, a guarantee that she would be sustained in her truth, even if the world rejected her. The omnipresent narrator's focus was on the protagonist's evolution. From a conflicted soul in Eden, she became the manifestation of sovereignty in the desert, a pillar of strength that would inspire, centuries later, the oppressed to seek their own voice. Lilith's progression of faith reached its peak in the acceptance of her role as the counterpoint. She understood that her existence was vital to the balance of creation. The triumph was not the annulment of slander, but its transcendence. The contrast of victory lay in the fact that, while Adam and his descendants were concerned with the earth and the flesh, Lilith became an elemental force, a guardian of the deepest truths. The account evoked reverence for her resilience and indignation at the injustice that had transformed her into an evil myth. The drama was constant, yet focused. The description of the transformation was vivid and contrasting. The Lilith who could have been Adam's shadow, and the Lilith who became the light of her own essence. The solemn narrator, in his epic chronicle, detailed the sense of justice and redemption that arose from understanding that her ordeal was not a punishment, but a consecration. It was the epic of the soul detaching itself from external expectations to connect with inner truth, a tale of triumph over the most insidious adversity, the suppression of identity. Lilith's legacy was a silent prophecy that one day humanity would have to confront its untold history, and that the name that was feared would, in the end, be understood as the name of freedom. The shock and regret of the antagonists, the builders of the patriarchal order, were the certainty that the truth, even if delayed, would come to light, dismantling the malice and skepticism that had underpinned their narrative. The triumph seemed the inevitable fulfillment of the promise that the individual voice, once it finds its strength, cannot be silenced. In that journey of overcoming, Lilith, the restless one, became the physical and spiritual manifestation of sovereignty. Her ordeal had granted her knowledge that Eden could never offer, the wisdom of self-sufficiency. The Eternal, in an act of profound justice, allowed her to become the personification of the forbidden truth. The omnipresent narrator sensed her deepest motivation, not destruction, but enlightenment. She longed for a world where equality was not a concession, but a foundation, and her faith manifested in her persistence in pursuing that ideal. The narrative needed to create deep engagement, and for that, the contrast between slander and reality was crucial. The Lilith who devoured children was the projection of male fear of female autonomy. The real Lilith was the silent guardian of the principle of integrity. The final shock for the antagonists would come when they realized that the security they sought in oppression was an illusion, and that true order could only be achieved through the recognition of the equality that Lilith had defended. The ultimate triumph was her immortality as a symbol, more powerful than any earthly queen. The Eternal One had other plans for the exile, a design that placed her as the first witness to freedom. The specific detail about the initial ordeal, the demand for Adam's submission, and the final triumph, Lilith's unquestionable sovereignty, underscored the majesty of divine intervention, which was not a miracle but respect for choice. The epic chronicle of her redemption was the story of a soul that refused to be defined by pain, but became the definition of strength. The twist of fate, guided by a higher will, was the slow and inexorable erosion of the fear that the legend of Lilith had sown. The world, in its maturity, would begin to see beyond the monster and perceive the woman. The solemn narrator, with his ancestral vocabulary, elevated the tone of the narrative to an epic. Lilith, the first pilgrim, the first to choose the most difficult path for her truth. Her legacy was the prophecy that divine justice, though slow, is inevitable and manifests itself in the victory of unwavering faith. The Eternal, in his silent wisdom, had established a divine judgment for humanity, not for Lilith. The judgment was the inevitable confrontation with the lie that had been woven about the exile. Lilith's ordeal, the profound suffering of being slandered, was the test of faith that elevated her to a level of spiritual purity that Eden could not offer. The omnipresent narrator felt her pain and unwavering faith, the contrast between human frailty and the strength of a soul that encountered truth in the desert. Her redemption was not a return, but her consecration as a principle. Lilith's progression of faith lay in her refusal to succumb to despair or revenge. She transformed the solitude of apparent abandonment into a space of growth and power. The malice and skepticism of her antagonists, humanity fearing her freedom, were proof that her choice had been the right one. The narrative, like an epic tale of triumph, triumph focused on the acts of spiritual transformation. Humiliation became dignity, the test of faith became certainty, and triumph became eternal sovereignty. Lilith's legacy was the prophecy that the true alliance is with one's own essence. The solemn narrator, with his dramatic eloquence, described the final triumph, Lilith becoming the mistress of shadows, not as a demon, but as the guardian of what is repressed, of what is forbidden, but vital to wholeness. The before and after of the ordeal was the transition from a dependent being to a complete being, an inevitable fulfillment of the promise that freedom is the most sacred gift. The drama of her saga was the internal struggle for identity. Lilith didn't need an army to win. Her victory was her permanence. The shock and regret her detractors would feel was the realization that, in trying to imprison her story, they had only given it a mythical force. The account caused reverence for its firmness, indignation at the injustice suffered, and satisfaction at the victory of a faith that manifested itself in autonomy. At that point in the narrative, Lilith's story solidified as the most powerful tale of divine justice that elevates morality. Not a morality of submission, but of integrity. The solemn narrator, with his voice of ancient saga, described the triumph as the revelation of divine purpose. Lilith was the testimony that equality is non-negotiable. Her ordeal, the deepest solitude, had been the price paid for her freedom, but also the key to her eternal glory, a legacy of unbreakable fidelity to her own being. The contrast was vivid and definitive. The forced and fragile order of Eden versus the chaotic yet authentic freedom of the desert. The narrative immersed the reader in the feeling that the twist of fate was the only possible conclusion for such a resolute soul. The skepticism and malice of the antagonists were dismantled by the simple and continuous existence of Lilith, living proof that truth cannot be eliminated, only temporarily. Silenced, she was the epic of overcoming through faith in one's own essence. The Eternal, in his majesty, had made Lilith the symbol of redemption through autonomy. The key detail of her ultimate triumph was the certainty that her name, once used to frighten, would one day be used to inspire. The shock to her detractors would be the realization that the force they tried to label as demonic was, in fact, the manifestation of the divine force inherent in all creation. Her transformation was complete. From creature, she became a cosmic principle. The focus of the Alliance protection was its invulnerability to slander. The world feared it, but could not destroy it. Lilith became the personification of the promise that suffering, when endured with faith in one's own truth, leads to triumph. The narrator, with his eloquent and dramatic language, concluded the chronicle with a sense of satisfaction at the victory of a soul that chose self-righteousness instead of false peace. The conclusion of the account resonated with the solemnity of a final judgment. Lilith's legacy was the prophecy that history would be rewritten, not by the hands of men, but by the silent cry of truth. She became the guardian of the boundary between what is permitted and what is true. The final contrast was the vision of a world that would one day be forced to acknowledge that the Lilith who departed from Eden was not the cause of the fall, but the first to seek ascension, the first to rise up for her integrity. And so the chronicler of the ages concludes the saga of the restless one. Lilith, the exiled one, the slandered one, became the sovereign of her destiny, living proof that faith in one's own essence is the highest form of obedience to the Creator. Her triumph, the inevitable fulfillment of the promise of her own freedom, remains an eternal question and a beacon of justice for all those who find themselves in the ordeal of solitude and apparent abandonment. Whoever hears this story can no longer be content with the version told, but must confront the truth that resides in Lilith's autonomy. Her victory is our redemption. The tale ends, but faith lives on. Subscribe, like, and be part of this mission to keep the light of truth burning.